Saint Louis Marie de Montfort once said, "We are never without warfare in a world of temptation. We cannot escape being scratched on a thorn-covered earth. Both, elect and reprobate, must bear their cross here, either willingly or unwillingly." To this effect, he composed the following hymn: "Three crosses stand on Calvary's height. One must be chosen, so choose aright. Like a saint you must suffer, or a penitent thief, or like the reprobate, in endless grief." We can conclude that suffering is a universal principle found in all the children of Adam, and that what distinguishes the saved from the damned is how they bear their cross. It seems most opportune that we try to understand not only the value of the cross, but how we are to carry it. For this purpose, let us consider the pious life of Henri Marie Boudon, a valiant reformer who bore his cross with all the love of a saint. Antoinette was given by God a holy husband. John was a man of virtue and courage, who by his wisdom, firmness, and example had led his wife to live a life of grace. However, for all the blessings that her husband had given her, after 15 years she had so far failed to give him a child. Like Saint Anne of old, Antoinette would be seen praying to the Almighty, begging that she too could become a mother. And heaven was not deaf to her cries. And one day a woman, described as grave and majestic, approached her and related that she would have a son, and he would become the glory of his house. Not long after this incident, on the 14th of January, 1624, Antoinette gave birth to the subject of our story, Henri Marie Boudon. Even in his earliest years, Boudon was a marvel of sanctity. As a child, he had read a life of St. John, and inspired by grace, he vowed to follow his example in all things, a vow which he faithfully kept his whole life. Like the innocent St. John, Henri Marie could only find room for God in his young and pious heart. Many would hear the boy repeating sayings such as, "Let us act and suffer for God alone. Let us live for God alone. God alone suffices for us." And these were no empty sentiments. Henri Marie would prove his piety when in an early age his father would die, and his mother would marry a man of low estate, described as vulgar and coarse, rough and repulsive. And with her new decline in social status, his mother would even go so far as to use his inheritance to buy a title of nobility for her new husband. But the young Henri Marie handled it like a saint. Despite the behavior of his new stepfather, he always obeyed him and treated him with such respect that many came to believe that he truly was his father, a mistake that even one of his biographers made. But Boudon was now neglected, having nobody save God alone. The young boy still smiled and continued to try to imitate his good St. John. And other children began to notice his sanctity. They started to follow him to Mass and try their best to reproduce his devotion. And on his part, he would exhort them, teaching them how to live a life of grace and repent of their faults. It would not be long before Henri Marie was sent to a boarding school, which, by his pious efforts, began to take on the likeness of a religious community. He recruited like-minded children to join him in pious exercises, and they began to live as true slaves of Mary. Every day they gathered in a little oratory to honor their queen. They made frequent pilgrimages to her churches. She was always the subject of their recreations. And even during the night, they would wake one another to sing canticles to her. The young boys would even vow to forever defend the Immaculate Conception of the Holy Mother of God. Later in life, a man would attribute his salvation to this little group organized by Boudon. Another would attribute his vocation. The holiness of the young man became like a shining city on a hill, and countless people of all states of life began to seek him out to ask for his advice. It shouldn't surprise us, then, that Boudon would become a priest. Henri Marie would later speak of his tonsure, saying, "On that day, I took God for my lot and my portion, a portion wholly sufficient, and to him who has taken it, nothing remains to be taken or hoped for. From that moment on, I could possess nothing but God alone." During Boudon's preparation to enter the priestly state, one of his good friends, Saint Francois de Laval, was preparing to leave France to become the first bishop of Quebec. But before he could leave, he had to resign his archdeaconry of Évreux, and he knew that no man was as suitable for the position as the young Henri Marie Boudon. At this time, for years, the devil had made war against the church in France, doing it mainly through ignorance and laxity in the clergy. St. Vincent de Paul would even remark that the church had no worse enemies than her priests. Boudon would now stand in spirit with the likes of Cardinal de Bérulle, St. Vincent de Paul, and St. John Eudes as one of the great reformers of the 17th century France. And as an archdeacon, it is not a stretch to say that his job was reform. For his duties were to visit the parishes of the diocese, checking for irregularities in finances, liturgy, and morals. And unfortunately, these were not rare. One of his first objects of his reforms was to ensure that the sanctuaries of the diocese were becoming of a house of God. Too frequently, the good priest had seen our Lord reposed in filthy chapels, priests in stained albs, tin and silver vessels on the altar, and altars unadorned. The chapels were unfortunately too often a mirror image of the priest and his flock. Thus, the sanctification of the laity too was a special object of Boudon's efforts. Setting an example for the priests, whenever he visited a parish, he would always preach, exhorting the faithful to a deeper love of God. But he wouldn't be content with this. No, Boudon would go further, and with great solicitude, he would gather a list of the greatest sinners of the parish and those who had neglected their Easter duty. And with the tenderness of the Good Shepherd, he would go after them, seeking to do anything he could to bring them back to their Father's house. But thus far, Boudon in life had enjoyed a wonderful reputation, having many friends and seldom an enemy. But Henri Marie Boudon was now a reformer, and to the countless deformers ever present in the membership of the Holy Catholic Church, there could be nothing worse. The priests of Évreux were tired of their archdeacon's stirring exhortations and grave remonstrances to do their duties, and to their dismay, the bishop soon gave Boudon a second office, that of Vicar General of the diocese. Henri Marie was now armed all the more to carry out his reforms, and those malicious priests were all the more tired of this zealous archdeacon and Vicar General. So they began to wait for an opportunity to rid themselves of the man who pined for God alone. Their chance soon came. One day, as Boudon was preaching in the pulpit, he became incredibly ill. Almost collapsing, he descended the pulpit to quickly find medical attention. Unfortunately, there were few places back in those days ready for someone in such a condition. There were no hospitals. However, by the grace of God, a wealthy woman, recently widowed, offered her home to Boudon in hopes that he could receive the necessary care. It was thought that he was going to die. He received extreme unction and prepared for his oncoming death, but it didn't come. Soon, it became clear that Boudon was going to live. However, he was still left in a state of extreme weakness. He would remain in the home of the widow, Madame Deformer, receiving all the medical treatment necessary to help him recover. Unfortunately, this incident proved to be the beginning of the greatest cross in the life of Boudon. It was, in fact, one of the hardest crosses that any man has to face, the cross of calumny. Our Reformer had long made enemies in Evreux, some of the worst being the Jansenists. The tendency of this heresy was always to try to reform the church without the church. Boudon reported their secret meetings and was permitted to fight them with all his might. But now, having angered the two kinds of deformers, the lax and those who work outside of the authority of the Holy Church, he now was the subject of a cruel conspiracy. Soon, these dissatisfied priests began to publish cruel pamphlets accusing Boudon of having committed the grossest impurities with the widow, at whose home he had stayed when he lay suspended between life and death. And one of his greatest persecutors was a certain religious whose reputation for holiness and austerity convinced countless men of the wicked deed that Boudon was supposed to have done. In fact, it would often be that good men would cause him the most suffering. The pious Bishop de Maupas was one of these good men. Despite being known for his great humility, he also had a certain imprudence natural to his temperament. He never trusted his own judgment. Now the good bishop was surrounded by men claiming to act in the interests of God. They said that the bishop was morally bound to repair the scandal caused by the archdeacon. So once again, the bishop was a good man, but of weak will. His intuition told him that Boudon was holy, but could he really be right and his priests be wrong? For 8 years, the bishop proceeded to ruthlessly persecute Boudon. His faculties to hear confession and preach would be taken away. He would be shamefully removed from his post as vicar general. Priests even refused to hear his confession, all while the town began to treat him with the utmost contempt. To make matters worse, Madame Deformer would take justice upon herself. She began by waging a furious campaign against the bishop. She enlisted her friends, even some far, far away, to join her in writing scalding letters to the bishop, demanding Boudon's reinstatement. No matter how much Boudon begged, no matter how much he pleaded, Madame Deformer continued with her impious behavior all the more. And so the bishop's response would be obvious, but in a way justified. For Bishop de Maupas could only grow more enraged at the man who appeared to be not only the cause of a great scandal, but also a revolution. Once the holy Archdeacon of Evreux realized that little good could be accomplished in his diocese, he began to go elsewhere, giving missions. And these would be met with a great, although short-lived, success. As the Bishop of Evreux, having been convinced of Boudon's supposed wickedness, he would begin to follow him around from diocese to diocese. And after Boudon would give a mission, the bishop would soon appear to alert the town as to who Boudon really was. All in order to, in his mind, prevent a grave scandal. Another incident, just as ridiculous, comes to us when Henri fell deathly ill. Now he would recover, but for a while the good priest remained dormant on a pallet, unable to do anything for himself. Many knew of his condition, but out of fear of incurring the bishop's displeasure, they refused to help him. The calumny had infected the town so much that people even began to debate whether or not it was morally acceptable to help a dying man. As Edward Healy Thompson would say, the question was decided. Boudon must be left to die. One can imagine the heart-wrenching pain felt by the man who had to suffer that trial. But what makes Boudon so impressive is that he cried out, God alone, as he continually leaned upon providence. Far from holding any hostilities towards his persecutors, Boudon counted them as his best friends. In a letter, Boudon would even go so far as to say, I endeavor, with the help of heaven, to speak well of the bishop everywhere. Confirming this statement, he wrote of his bishop being his good father and his good prelate. In other words, despite being suppressed by the hierarchy, Boudon refused to lose his piety. What is more, Boudon would submit to the cross like our Lord, with silence and humility. His friends, of course, would be confounded by his course of action, yet the humble archdeacon defended his position, saying, It seems to me that I ought to keep silence and not take precautions. Let what happen will. Should our best friends turn against us, they are but creatures, that is, things of nothing. There is but God alone. For the rest, I deserve all that can be said and done against me, and I deserve far more. I deserve hell. Now it would be this acceptance of the cross that proved to be Henri Marie's vindication. He trusted that Christ would deliver him if and only if it be his will. Had Boudon suffered like the reprobate, complaining about his bishop, fighting with his bishop, or working against or outside of his bishop, he would be worthy of reproach regardless of his original innocence. Divine justice would be unable to vindicate him, lest we learn that disobedience, impiety, and reform all go hand in hand. No, it was because Boudon chose to accept the injustices of his bishop that God was able to liberate him from the hands of his enemies, and that he did. Boudon's vindication came from a handful of causes, but we will consider the one that is perhaps the most important and most telling. Let us recall that the greatest propagator of the calumny was a religious, known as a pious, holy, and austere man. Indeed, it was his reputation that led many good men to believe in his words. But his reputation was founded on an edifice of pride. The religious, known for his religion, fell into the very sin that he had accused Boudon of. And soon, good men would realize that they had been duped. Wicked men realized that in continuing to persecute Boudon, they would reveal their wickedness. So at last, they surrendered. Boudon was restored to favor, and that religious would now inherit the scorn that Boudon had so long been subjected to. That poor religious, who had so long enjoyed the esteem of men, was now without a friend. He became struck by compunction and not knowing what to do. Like the Magdalene, he sought after Boudon, weeping, sobbing, and yes, repenting. Henri Marie now found himself restored to his former glory, and before him was the man who had caused him so much pain. The man who was a scandal to thousands. Would Boudon not be right in upbraiding him for his injustice? He had been a true enemy of reform in a time when souls were falling into hell like snowflakes. And now Boudon finally stood over his enemy. What was he to do? What would he do? Boudon would forgive him. Like the prodigal father, the second he heard that this sinner was seeking him, Henri Marie ran after him and grabbed a hold of him. Now in his arms, he would receive him with the greatest love and compassion. The religious confessed to him his envy, his pride, everything that caused him to calumniate such a holy man. But Boudon did not care. The only concern of Henri Marie was this man's soul. Moved with mercy, he absolved the sinner, and until the end of his life would direct him in his newfound penitence. At his death, the religious would die in the loving arms of the man that he had so long and so ruthlessly persecuted. With Boudon's innocence being confirmed, Bishop de Maurepas would do everything in his power to make restitution to the poor archdeacon. Now, with the obedience of the priests, Boudon would continue his reforms with much success. He would still give missions, doing everything that he could for any chosen soul. During his trial, he had the opportunity to write many books, and now found himself flooded with letters asking for advice. Knowing how much good a reply can do for someone in desolation, Boudon would answer them all. Above all, Henri Marie would preserve a special concern for religious. If he detected even the slightest hint of spiritual distress in some religious, he would leave Evreux as quickly as he could to go and console that poor spirit. Towards the end of his life, he would develop seizures which often led him paralyzed, all accompanied by sharp bodily pains. And finally, on the 31st of August, 1702, in his 79th year, Boudon would die. Surrounded by men assisting him at his death, he whispered to one of them assisting at his bedside, saying, "Tell the persons here that I exhort them with all my heart to love and serve God fervently, and that, in the land of God alone, whither I am going, everyone will be compelled by force or by love to acknowledge that this was all they had to do in this world." With that, he surrendered his soul to God. Let us recall the principle of Saint Louis de Montfort. We all suffer, but what distinguishes the elect from the damned is how we suffer. Boudon would prove himself to be a true friend and lover of the cross. Following in the footsteps of Christ, he submitted to his persecutors in total abandonment, love, forgiveness, piety, obedience, and silence. Boudon was a successful reformer, fighting against the laxity of the day precisely because he embraced his cross. And now, as we deal with a similar but far worse age of laxity, Henri Marie Boudon's pious life shows us how to suffer like Christ. And if we can do this, our efforts will likewise be crowned with success. But if we suffer like the bad thief, falling into the temptations of impiety, rebellion, disobedience, pride, and presumption, we will not only fail as we fight for the traditional faith, but we will likewise lose our souls.